Hey there, all you philosophy fans out there, ready to really get those brain gears turning?
I know I am.
Great. Well, today we're going deep, deep, deep into this super interesting idea called truthlikeness.
Truthlikeness.
Yeah, and I'm so stoked to be unpacking this with you, especially since, well, you're a philosopher.
It's definitely one of those concepts that makes you rethink, well, everything you thought you knew about, truth and falsehood.
Totally. Hold on a sec. Can some things that are technically false be closer to the truth than other false things?
Yeah.
And can some truth be more accurate or more informative than other truths? Huh. It's a real mind bender.
It really is.
Okay, so we're using this awesome entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on truthlikeness as our map for this deep dive.
Great source.
Yeah, it's seriously in depth. So to kick things off, let's imagine we're trying to figure out how many planets are in our solar system.
Okay, I'm with you.
All right, so saying there are 9 is wrong, right? We all know that now.
Right, but isn't it way closer to the truth than saying, I don't know, there are 9 billion planets?
That's a great example. It really highlights how there can be degrees of truth and falsehood. It's not always a simple black and white situation.
Totally. So how do we even begin to grapple with this idea of degrees of truth?
Well, I think a good place to start is with truth itself. The concept of truth.
Yeah, okay, truth.
So truth, it's usually seen as the goal of, any kind of inquiry, whether it's science, philosophy, or just, trying to figure out what to have for dinner.
Makes sense. We want to know what's actually true, right?
Right. But here's the thing. Even those philosophers who focus on, say, empirical adequacy or knowledge, still, they still consider truth to be a fundamental element.
Yeah, yeah.
But the thing is, truth as a concept, it's kind of coarse-grained is the term they use.
That's coarse-grained?
Yeah. So, it doesn't really capture all the nuances. Some truths can be, more informative or more accurate than others. Yeah, I get that. It's kind of like saying something exists. That's a true statement.
Right.
But, it doesn't really tell us much.
Right. It's true, but not very enlightening.
So, where does this whole truthlikeness thing fit into this? Why is it even important?
Well, truthlikeness really kind of took off as a philosophical idea in the mid-20th century.
The mid-20th century, huh?
Yeah, and it was around this time that philosophers started really getting serious about fallibilism.
Fallibilism. Ooh, now there's a word.
Right.
But, just for our listeners out there who might not, have that one on the tip of their tongues.
Sure. So fallibilism is basically just this idea that, we can be wrong about things.
We can be wrong.
Oh, yeah, all the time. It's saying that our beliefs, our theories, even our best scientific theories, they might be false. We can't be absolutely certain about anything.
Oh, okay. That's kind of humbling, huh?
It is. And it created a bit of a challenge, for the traditional view of inquiry. Because if our theories are likely to be false, like fallibilism suggests, then how can we even measure progress in science or philosophy?
Right. If we're always potentially wrong, how do we know if we're getting closer to the truth?
Exactly. And that's where truthlikeness comes in. It's this idea that, okay, maybe our current theories are probably false, but some of them might still be closer to the truth than others. And that's how we can make progress.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Good.
So truthlikeness is kind of this way of acknowledging that, yeah, we might never reach absolute certainty, but we can still, get closer and closer to the truth.
Exactly. It's all about progress and refinement.
Cool. So how do we actually go about defining this truth-likeness thing? How do we even measure it?
Well, there are 3 main approaches, and, each has its own strengths and weaknesses, of course.
Oh, of course. Philosophy, right?
Right. So the first one is called the content approach, and it was pioneered by this philosopher named Karl Popper.
Okay.
And he basically proposed that you compare the truth content and the falsity content of propositions.
So weighing how much truth a statement gets right against how much falsehood it gets wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems simple enough, but I'm guessing it's not that straightforward.
You got it. Popper's initial proposal, it ran into some problems. It actually led to some pretty counterintuitive results. It suggested that no falsehood could ever be closer to the truth than even the most basic, totally uninformative truth.
Whoa, wait a minute. Can you, give me an example? Because my brain is starting to hurt a little bit.
Sure. So imagine you have 2 statements, okay? One statement is, the number of planets in our solar system is greater than 9. and the other is the number of planets is either less than or greater than 9.
Okay, got it.
So the first one, it's actually false, right? We know there are 8 planets.
Yeah.
But the second statement, it's true, but it's kind of like obvious and not very informative.
Yeah, for sure.
And Popper's initial approach actually suggested that the second statement, the true but uninformative one, is more truth-like than the first statement, even though the first statement, while false, is actually closer to the real number of planets.
Yeah, I can see how that's like a problem.
Right. So simply counting up truths and falsehoods, it just wasn't enough to really capture the essence of truthlikeness.
So what do they do? How do they fix it?
Well, philosophers, they kept working on it. They tried to refine the content approach. And one way they did that was by focusing on the relevance of consequences, not just all consequences.
Relevance. Okay, so like some consequences are more important than others when we're judging truthlikeness.
Exactly.
Okay, so like give me an example. How does this relevance thing work?
Okay, so let's stick with this planetary motion thing. Imagine we have 2 competing theories about how the planets move, okay?
2 theories.
So one theory, it perfectly predicts the positions of the planets, but it says absolutely nothing about what they're made of, their composition.
Gotcha.
And the other theory, it gets the positions like slightly wrong, but it does give us some insights into the planet's composition.
Interesting.
So this refined content approach would actually favor the first theory, the one that gets the positions right.
Even though it doesn't say anything about what the planets are made of.
Right, and that's because it more accurately captures the relevant consequences, which in this case are the planet's positions. We're not really concerned with their composition in this particular example.
Got it, got it. So it's all about picking out the consequences that really matter for the specific question we're asking.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, but how do we determine which consequences are relevant? I mean, couldn't that be kind of subjective? Like, couldn't we just cherry pick the consequences that support what we already believe?
That's a really important point, and it's actually one of the big challenges of the content approach. Defining relevance in a non-arbitrary way, that's tricky. It's definitely something that needs more philosophical exploration.
Yeah, and, applying this approach to really complex scientific theories with, like, tons of consequences, that can be a real headache.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about this content approach, but you said there were like 3 main approaches to truthlikeness, right?
Right. So the second approach, well, it actually kind of builds on some of the ideas from the content approach,
Yeah.
but it tries to address some of those, limitations we were just discussing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What's the second approach all about?
So this one is called the consequence approach.
The consequence approach, got it. And like the content approach, it involves, analyzing the consequences of a theory.
Okay, so how is it?
Well, the big difference is that the consequence approach is much more focused. It zeroes in on the consequences that are relevant to the inquiry, to the specific question you're trying to answer. It's not about looking at all the consequences, just the ones that really matter.
So it's like being more selective, right? Picking out the consequences that actually relate to what we're trying to figure out.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing, the consequences that directly impact the issue at hand.
Can you give me like a concrete example? I think that would help me wrap my head around this.
Sure. Let's go back to our planetary motion example. So imagine we have these 2 competing theories, right?
Okay.
And one theory, let's say, it accurately predicts where the planets will be,
Yeah.
but it doesn't tell us anything about what they're made of, their composition.
Gotcha.
The other theory, it gets the positions slightly wrong, but it does offer some insights into the planet's composition.
Interesting. So which theory would the consequence approach favor?
Well, in this case, it would favor the first theory, the one that accurately predicts the planet's positions.
Even though it doesn't tell us anything about what they're made of.
Right, and that's because it nails the relevant consequences, which in this case are the planet's positions. We're not really concerned with their composition in this particular scenario.
Okay, that makes sense. So the consequence approach prioritizes accuracy in the specific area that we're investigating, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how we decide which consequences are relevant. Isn't there like a danger of just choosing the consequences that fit our pre-existing beliefs?
You've hit on a really crucial point. The challenge is to come up with a clear, objective way to define relevance. We don't want to fall into the trap of confirmation bias.
Right, right. So how do we avoid that trap? How do we make sure we're being objective about this whole relevance thing?
Well, one approach is to define relevance in terms of the goals of the inquiry. So you ask yourself, what are we actually trying to explain? What are we trying to predict? The consequences that directly relate to those goals, those would be the relevant ones.
Okay, so if we're trying to understand planetary motion, the relevant consequences would be the ones that help us, like actually understand and predict how the planets move.
Precisely.
Okay, cool. But I'm still wondering, like, even with this focus on goals, there's still room for debate about which consequences are truly relevant, right?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing philosophical discussion, and there's no easy answer.
And I imagine it gets even more complex when you're dealing with these big, grand scientific theories that have all these, like, far-reaching consequences.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that brings us to the third approach to truth-likeness, which takes a slightly different angle.
All right, I'm ready for approach number 3. Hit me with it.
So this approach shifts the focus away from content and consequences. Instead, it focuses on the idea of likeness or similarity.
Likeness. Similarity.
Okay, I'm listening.
So think about it this way. We have the actual world, the way things really are, right?
Yeah, good old reality.
Right. But then we also have all these other possible worlds representing all the different ways things could have been. Possible worlds. Now we're talking. This is starting to sound like some serious metaphysics.
It is. And these possible worlds can be anything, from slight variations of our own world to, like, totally different realities.
So like worlds where, I don't know, dinosaurs still roam the earth or gravity works in reverse.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless.
Whoa, mind blown. Okay, so how does this likeness approach actually work? How do we use these possible worlds to figure out truth likeness?
So the basic idea is this. We're measuring how similar a statement's possible worlds are to the actual world. The closer those possible worlds are to our reality, the more truth-like the statement is considered.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. So it's kind of like we're comparing different versions of reality to see which ones match up best with our own experience.
Yes, exactly. Think of it like this. Each possible world is like a point in this huge logical space.
Logical space, huh?
Yeah, and the closer a statement's possible worlds are to the actual world in the space, the more truth-like that statement is considered.
So a statement that's true in a possible world that's very similar to ours would be considered more truth-like than a statement that's only true in a possible world that's like totally wacky and different.
Precisely. It's all about minimizing the distance between a statement's possible worlds and the actual world.
Okay, I like this. It's like we're playing a game of cosmic hot or cold, trying to get as close as possible to the actual truth.
I like that. And you know, we can actually use math to quantify this distance. There are different metrics like average distance, minimum, maximum average, minimum sum average.
Whoa, whoa, slow down. You're losing me with all the math talk. But I get the general idea. We're measuring how closely a statement's possible worlds align with the actual world.
Right.
It's like we're comparing blueprints of different houses to the blueprint of the actual house to see which one is the closest match.
That's a great analogy. But of course, like the other approaches, this likeness approach also has its share of challenges. For example, how do we objectively define and measure the distance between possible worlds?
Yeah, that's a good point. What if, like, two people disagree about which possible world is the closest to the actual world? It seems like that could get pretty subjective.
Absolutely, and that takes us to this problem called framework dependence. Our judgments about similarity, they might actually be influenced by the specific language and concepts we use to describe those worlds.
Oh, right. I remember we talked about that before with the planetary motion example. Our judgments about which theory was closer to the truth, they seem to change depending on whether we were focusing on positions or compositions.
Exactly. And that's a real worry. It suggests that truth-likeness might be relative to the framework we're using.
So it's like saying that truth likeness is in the eye of the beholder.
In a way, yes. And that raises some pretty big questions.
Like, if we can't even agree on which possible world is most similar to our own, how can we possibly know if we're actually making progress toward greater truth likeness? I mean, it's like we're aiming at a moving target.
That's a crucial question, and it gets to the heart of what's called the epistemological problem of truth-likeness.
Yeah. Epistemological problem. Sounds intimidating.
It's a mouthful, but it's a really important issue. It's one thing to define truth-likeness in theory, on paper, but it's another thing entirely to figure out how we can actually know if we're getting closer to the truth in practice.
Yeah, because we're working with this assumption, right, this fallibilist view, that we could always be wrong. So how can we be sure we're on the right track if we can't be absolutely certain about anything?
That's the dilemma. It's like we're trying to navigate through a maze in the dark. We know we want to reach the center, but we can't see the path clearly.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So what do we do? How do we find our way out of this epistemological maze?
Well, the key is to remember that even though we can't be certain about the whole truth, and that's the whole point of fallibilism, We can still make estimates based on the evidence we do have.
So we're like detectives trying to piece together the most likely scenario based on the clues we've gathered.
Exactly. We use our best judgment, our reasoning skills, and all the available evidence to make informed judgments about truth-likeness. It's not about finding the absolute final answer, but about getting closer and closer to it.
So like we're constantly updating our understanding as new evidence comes in.
Right. We revise our beliefs, refine our theories, and try to make them as truth-like as possible based on what we know at the time.
Okay, I'm with you so far. We're using our best guesses based on evidence to navigate this whole truth likeness thing. But there's another thought that's been kind of bugging me.
Okay, what's that?
Why should we even care about all this? I mean, I get that truth is important, but why go through all this philosophical heavy lifting if we can never be absolutely sure we've actually arrived at the truth?
That's a great question, and it gets at the heart of what philosophers call the axiological problem of truth-likeness.
The axiological problem.
Yeah, basically, it's the question of why truth-likeness is valuable. Why should we bother with it? Does it actually make a difference to how we live our lives and make decisions?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Give me a good reason to care about this truth likeness stuff.
Okay, well, one way to think about it is to consider the practical benefits of having more truth-like beliefs. Remember that example we talked about earlier? The person who's really thirsty and needs to know if the glass contains water or poison?
Yeah, I remember.
So in that situation, having a belief that's closer to the truth is obviously going to be more helpful, right? It could literally be a matter of life or death.
True. So in some cases, having more truth-like beliefs can help us avoid danger and make better choices.
Exactly. But there's also a deeper, more intrinsic value to truth-likeness. It has to do with this idea that getting closer to the truth is inherently good, regardless of the practical consequences.
Okay, I think I see what you're getting at. It's like saying that knowledge and understanding are valuable in and of themselves, even if they don't have any immediate practical application.
Precisely. It's about satisfying our natural curiosity, expanding our understanding of the world, and getting things right. There's a certain intellectual satisfaction that comes from, seeing how the pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Yeah, I definitely get that. There's something really satisfying about figuring things out, even if it's just for the sake of understanding. Like solving a tricky crossword puzzle or finally grasping a difficult concept.
And this ties into the idea of cognitive value, which is the value of having accurate and well-supported beliefs.
Cognitive value. Okay, so how do we measure that? Can we actually quantify how good a belief is?
Well, some philosophers have tried to develop ways to measure cognitive value. They've come up with these things called scoring rules.
Scoring rules for beliefs.
Yep. One way to think about it is to consider how well a belief matches up with reality. The more accurate the belief, the higher its cognitive value.
So like the more truth it captures and the less falsehood it contains.
Yes, but it's more nuanced than that. Some of these scoring rules take into account not just whether a belief is true or false, but also the strength of the belief and how much evidence supports it.
So it's not just about being right or wrong, but about having the right level of confidence in your beliefs based on what you know.
Exactly. It's about having a belief system that's well calibrated to the world.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't there a potential conflict here? We're talking about maximizing cognitive value, which seems like it means we should always be striving for the most accurate, truth-like beliefs.
Right.
But at the same time, we're embracing fallibilism, the idea that we might always be wrong. Those two things seem like they're pulling in opposite directions.
You've hit on a very subtle but important point. This tension between maximizing cognitive value and accepting our fallibility is a major challenge for any theory of truth-likeness.
So how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposing ideas?
Well, one way is to focus on what's called expected truth-likeness.
Expected truth-likeness. What's that?
Yeah. It's acknowledging that we may never be able to know for certain how truth-like our beliefs are, but we can still make our best estimates based on the available evidence.
So it's like saying, look, we may never reach the summit of Mount Everest, but we can still make progress towards it, even if it's just setting up base camp at a higher altitude.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge while still striving to improve our understanding.
I like that. It reminds us that progress is still possible, even in the face of uncertainty. But here's another thought that's been swirling around in my head.
I'm all ears.
If we're always revising our beliefs based on new evidence, isn't there a risk that we'll end up chasing an ever-shifting target? What if our judgments about truth-likeness keep changing as we learn more? How can we be sure we're actually making progress if the goalposts keep moving?
Excellent point. That raises the question of whether truth-likeness is stable enough to be a reliable guide for inquiry. If our judgments about truth-likeness are constantly fluctuating, how can we be sure we're not just on a wild goose chase?
Right. It feels like we need some kind of anchor, something to make sure that our pursuit of truth-likeness isn't just futile.
One possible anchor is the idea that some conceptual frameworks are simply better than others at, carving up reality.
So it's not just about the content of our beliefs, but about the very language and concepts we use to describe the world.
Precisely. Remember our planetary motion example? We saw how judgments of truth-likeness could change depending on whether we were talking about positions or compositions.
Right, it seemed like truth-likeness was relative to the language we were using.
Yeah.
Kind of unsettling, to be honest.
I know, it's a big concern. But if some frameworks are objectively better than others, if they actually capture the structure of reality more accurately, then maybe we do have a way to ground our judgments of truth-likeness in something more solid.
So we're not just adrift in a sea of language games. There might be a true north for truth-likeness, even if it's hard to find.
Exactly. And that's where things get really metaphysically interesting. Are there, objective joints in reality just waiting to be discovered by our best theories? Or is the world ultimately a more fluid, less determinate place? These are questions that philosophers have been grappling with for ages, and truth-likeness brings a whole new dimension to the debate.
It's like we're trying to map this, constantly shifting landscape.
Right.
We're searching for solid ground, but the terrain keeps changing beneath our feet.
That's a brilliant way to put it. It really captures, the dynamic nature of inquiry, right? We're always refining our understanding, gathering new information, and developing new tools to think with.
So, where does all this leave us in our exploration of truth-likeness? We've looked at these three main approaches: the content approach, the consequence approach, and the likeness approach.
Right.
And each one has, its own
Mhm.
strengths and weaknesses, but we're still left with these, really fundamental questions. How do we even define truth-likeness? How do we measure it?
Yeah.
And, why should we even care?
Yeah, those are the big questions for sure. But I actually think that the very act of wrestling with these questions, that's kind of the point. Truth-likeness forces us to confront these foundational issues about truth, knowledge, and progress. It makes us think critically about the limitations of our own ways of thinking and, well, the inherent uncertainty of our quest for knowledge.
It's like we're taking a flashlight and shining it on the very structure of how we think. We're questioning what it even means to get closer to the truth when we might never be able to fully grasp it.
Exactly. And I think this is especially important for you as a philosopher. Truth-likeness encourages a much more nuanced and sophisticated approach to philosophical inquiry. It reminds us that, even without absolute certainty, we can still make real progress toward a better understanding of the world.
So it's not just about finding the truth with a capital T, but about this ongoing process of refining our understanding, getting closer and closer to a more accurate picture of reality, even if we never quite reach the final destination.
Exactly. It's about the journey, not just the destination. And that journey, with all its twists and turns, its revisions and refinements, that's a crucial part of the philosophical process.
This has been like a total mind-bending deep dive. We've explored these different interpretations of truth-likeness. We've grappled with the challenges of, actually measuring it, and we've even pondered its ultimate value.
Right. And we've seen how truth-likeness makes us re-examine our assumptions about truth itself and the whole process of inquiry. It reminds us that progress in philosophy, just like in science, is often about getting closer to the truth rather than having this definitive arrival.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but we've also left some big questions unanswered. Questions that I hope will, get our listeners thinking. Like, if truth-likeness really is dependent on our framework, as we've discussed, does that mean there's, no objective way to measure progress in philosophy?
Or could it be that it points to an even deeper connection between our conceptual frameworks and the actual structure of reality? Are our frameworks just tools, or do they reflect something more fundamental about the universe? Something baked into the fabric of reality?
Whoa, those are some deep questions.
Mhm.
Questions that philosophers have been debating for centuries, it seems like.
For sure. And truth-likeness brings this whole new perspective to the table.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does.
Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of truth-likeness. I hope you've enjoyed it, dear listener.
Me too.
And I hope it's left you with a deeper appreciation for just how complex and fascinating this whole idea of truth really is.
Keep those philosophical gears turning.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep on philosophizing.